Hello everybody, today we're going to be listening to a performance of the first movement of Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor. This was given by the Shreveport Symphony in the early spring of 2019. It is one of the best known works in the repertoire, one of Mozart's best known pieces for sure. But just because it's well known and familiar to both musicians and audiences doesn't mean that it's entirely clear exactly how one ought to play this piece. At least if you look at the notes on the page. There are indications as to pitch and to rhythm and very rudimentary indications as to dynamics. But beyond that, there are a whole host of decisions that need to be made in order to have a unified concept of this piece and to be able to present that as again, a unified idea by 40, 50 musicians who happen to be playing it. So I'm going to just take you through some of the things that I notice when looking at a score and decisions that I have to make and how I go about actually indicating those decisions, both for myself and also for the musicians, so that we can make our rehearsal process as efficient as possible. So I'm just going to show you the score, the opening page of this piece, and I'll sort of talk you through some of the questions that come up as I look at it. So here then is the opening of the first movement of Symphony No. 40. Primarily the action is centered in the strings, but you do have to take notice of what's going on in the woodwinds, at least in terms of how they're laid out. First thing you have to know actually is that Mozart wrote two versions of this symphony. The first was written for one flute, two oboes, and two bassoons. That's what you see here. Later on, he added a pair of clarinets as an option. Clarinets were not invariably part of the orchestra in Mozart's day. They tended to be certainly in much more common use toward the end of his life. But even so, one could imagine an orchestra assembling without a pair of clarinets. Anyway, one has a choice as a conductor which version you're going to employ. I almost always ask orchestras to play the version that has the pair of clarinets. And so there are then some differences that one has to be aware of as a conductor. For example, a little bit later on in this first movement, the first appearance of the woodwinds is down here. This line was originally written for oboes, or just first oboe actually. The indication is there to play a little rising line that begins on F sharp. Later in the revision, he asked the clarinet, first clarinet, to play that same line. So in the version we would be playing and that we did record, the oboe did not play this, but rather, which is why I scratched it out for myself, but rather the clarinet played it, and you can tell that because the F sharp down here that's given to the oboe is the same note that the clarinet plays, although that looks like, I understand, a G sharp. In fact, it is a printed G sharp. It will sound a step lower than that. It will sound an F sharp when played by B-flat clarinets. They are transposing instruments. They effectively move down in reality everything that they see on the page. And you know that these are clarinets in B-flat because you look up here and you see that Mozart has written clarinetti in B. Now, B in German usage means B-flat. Germans use the letter H to refer to B natural. So these are clarinets in B flat. In other words, they transpose a whole step down. It's also interesting, by the way, that he uses clarinetti, spelled with a C and with the plural being an I at the end. So that's the Italian word, but yet uses the letter B to indicate B flat, which is a German usage. So there you go. That was Mozart mixing different approaches, or different languages, really. So here is the very first phrase that's indicated, and all you see in the score is a piano, the letter P printed. The rest are notes and rhythms, but there's nothing that tells you much about exactly how the phrase ought to be played, how it ought to be nuanced, I suppose you could say. It's familiar, I'm sure. Di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-da-dum, ti-ga-dum, ti-ga-dum, ti-ga-dum. which essentially consists of a phrase that rises and then one that falls again, an antecedent and a consequent phrase, we would say. And so generally one would have an increasing volume in the first phrase and a decreasing volume in the second. That happens almost instinctively as you play it and as you hear it. But nonetheless, I've indicated for myself a crescendo and a decrescendo, as you can see there. But there is also the question of this little gesture right here, which is to say, it comes at the end of an antecedent phrase, which one would naturally assume is increasing in volume. But would I really want to hear di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-da-da, di-a-dum? I mean, the answer is I would not. So really, I conceive of this anyway as having the macro shape is increasing in volume. The micro shape of these two little notes is a diminishment, really, or a softening of the second note. Di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-ta-dum. Which is to say that the stress comes on the first beat, and then the second beat is less stress. So I use the horizontal line to indicate a stress, and then this is not actually an up bow indication, but rather an unstressed mark. I just recall those from, I think, even elementary school, where you would try to indicate where the stressed and unstressed syllables were in words. So that's the kind of indications I make for myself that let me know a little bit about what I want to do with it. A little bit later on, we have the first change in dynamic, which is a printed forte here. But again, there's not much nuance given by Mozart. There are two phrases here in a row, and then one that is a little bit longer. So I asked them the one that begins, the longer one, to actually start a little bit softer. So I've indicated mezzo forte there, which is less loud than forte, with a crescendo. Up to a return, really, of this initial idea, di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-ta-dum. And the question there is, do you just kind of proceed exactly in tempo or not? And Mozart does not indicate that one ought to change tempo at all, but it does seem natural to me and to many people to take a little bit of time when the return to this idea occurs. And so I've indicated that by writing that sort of universally understood squiggle above the notes, and I've written the four letters P-O-C-H, which is an abbreviation for pochissimo. So poco in Italian is little, and pochissimo is a very little bit. So I mean this to be just ever so slight. And then just another little decision you have to make. Di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-da-dum, di-a-dum, 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 like before. And then it goes di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-da-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-dum. So it is modulating, essentially. But it's a sequence, really. We have an antecedent and a consequent phrase, but then essentially the same phrase again, except that it begins a step higher. We started here, di-a-dum, E flat. Now it's da-da-dum, starting on F natural, a whole step higher. So whenever a composer is essentially giving you the same idea twice, it seems to me that one ought to do something different with that second appearance. Either make it louder, make it softer, change the articulation, something. And in this case, it seems to me he's being more emphatic. He's going up in pitch. So I asked him, instead of starting in piano, to start in mezzo piano, which is a little bit louder than piano. So those are kinds of indications, again, that I have made for myself. So let me just then show you what has to happen next. What I've done is indicated a few things in the parts for the musicians to have a look at. In this case, I determined some bowings that they ought to use, starting at down bow here, as you perhaps can see. But that indication of the crescendo that I mentioned, di-a-dum, di-a-dum, di-a-da-dum, is there, but also that drop-in dynamic from the D to the B flat. Ya-dum. I've indicated as well with a little bit of a diminuendo. Di-a-dum, 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 bum. The fact that that goes down in pitch is obvious, but the fact that it goes down in dynamic is indicated by that diminuendo sign that I have there. So these are essentially what I have in my part, but they are now, in my score rather, but they have also been added to the actual parts that the musicians are going to see, so that I don't have to explain all of that in words or conduct it so aggressively, demonstrably in a physical way that it becomes sort of distracting. They can see on the page the interpretation that I'm asking for, essentially. Let's see, what else do we have? There was that moment, yes, takatam, takatam, and forte, and then dropping to mezzo for ti-a-tam, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-tam, and then the return ti-a-tam, ti-a-tam, ti-a-ta-tam. There's that squiggle that I mentioned, and the person who was playing this part added the sort of universally understood pair of eyeglasses above the line there, which indicates either pay attention to this or watch the conductor, or perhaps both of those things. So those are some of the decisions that one has to make in order to perform, let's say, the first minute and a half of this piece, and it goes on from there. That's probably more detailed than you wanted, but anyway, I wanted to share with you a little bit of the process that goes on well before any rehearsing happens, and certainly before any performing of a work like this occurs. If you listen to 10 recordings of this piece, you will hear the same pitches and essentially the same rhythms, but you'll hear different tempos. You will hear lots of different decisions with regard to some of those dynamic nuances that I mentioned, articulation differences as well, whether things are longer, shorter, even what kind of a sound the orchestra is playing with, whether it's kind of a thick and rich sound or more of a lean, thinner, perhaps you might call it, sound, or maybe one with more bite at the beginning of each note. So I just wanted you to have this in mind as you listen to this performance that we're going to share with you now. I hope you enjoy it. The first movement of Mozart's Symphony No. 40.